Members of the Nebraska legislature are hoping to pass a parental bill of rights when it comes to their child's education. It's an effort to keep schools completely transparent. Tonight, our Marlo Lundak hears from a former teacher about what some are calling a divisive bill.
That Parental Bill of Rights grants parents more power over their child's education, potentially guiding that education to more closely align with their own values.
This doesn't seem to be about children at all. It seems to be about arousing passions along political lines, possibly in adults, but very little to do with actually educating students.
Bridget Donovan is a former teacher and the former president of the Omaha Education Association. She says some topics addressed in the bill, like allowing parents to speak at school board meetings or to review their child's curriculum or personal files, are already things that exist.
One of my first reactions is, what is the problem that this bill is supposed to be a solution for? It kind of looked like a solution in search of a problem to me.
But more than anything, Donovan is concerned. One section of the bill reads that parents, quote, have an opportunity to object to any learning material that impairs the parent's firmly held beliefs and withdraw such child from the class.
What if you feel that the role the United States played in the Japanese internment camp makes us look poorly, and you don't want your child to learn about that? So then we stop teaching history to children because somebody disagrees with it?
Donovan says that's not how education works.
Education should be exposing students to a wide variety of topics, and parents by all means have every right, and I would argue should be teaching what their values about those topics are. But education should not be teaching values. Education should be giving them the exposure to these things.
She says the bill could also potentially require more paperwork, record keeping, and oversight for already overworked educators.
There seems to be an attempt to erode the trust that people feel in their public schools.
On your site in Omaha, Marlo Lundak, 6 News.
And you can read the entire bill, which was introduced by 10 state senators, on our website, WOWT.com.